Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Ronald Angelo Johnson, the Ralph and Bessie Malin Chair of History here at Baylor University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of Baylor University's academic year-long series celebrating and connecting the scholarship of pioneers with contemporary issues, W.E.B. Du Bois and the 100th anniversary of his book, The Gift of Black Follk. The series came together through the collaboration and conception of Baylor University's Du Bois planning team of brilliant scholars and practitioners. And I just want to call them out right now because this would not be possible today without them. This team that I'm so proud to be a part of includes Dr. Stephanie Boddy, Associate Professor of Church and Community Ministries, Dr. Jamal Dominique Hopkins, Associate Professor of Christian Scriptures and Director of the Black Church Studies Program, Dr. Jerry Park, Associate Professor of Sociology, Dr. Ms. Sina Wood, Associate Professor and Documents Librarian, Mr. Ezra Cho, Theology and Philosophy Librarian, Mr. Carl Flynn, Director of Marketing and Communications for Information Technology at the University Libraries, and Dr. Stephen Breck-Reed, Vice Provost for Faculty Diversity and Belonging. It has been so great to work with them and watch this project come together as we've been talking and now to see it live. And we could not have done this without the grateful support of units all across Baylor for their generous support and their commitment to engaging historical, literary, and cultural topics from earlier periods and placing them in conversation with issues we face today. And those units are listed there on the screen. Now, last week, our colleagues, Dr. Hopkins and Dr. Park, kicked off the Du Bois series in style with a wonderful discussion of W.B. Du Bois, the man, the scholar, the legend, and the featured book, The Gift of Black Follk. I was especially touched by the personal recitation of Dr. Hopkins about growing up, about his first encounters with Du Bois, and his sharing of how Du Bois influences and continue to influence him as a scholar and as a person. Much of his history resonated with my own experiences as a young man growing up, learning about W.B. Du Bois. Now today, I have the pleasure of talking with some phenomenal scholars about the first two chapters of The Gift of Black Follk. Now, chapters 1 and 2 are titled, respectively, Black Explorers and Black Laborers. Now, I want to say right now, I'm learning that scholars are not the most normal of human beings, because as my colleagues, the panelists and I talked today, and I said, we're going to talk about chapters 1 and 2, I kept getting messages saying, well, do I have to just stick to 1 and 2? Can I talk about more? Because that's how we are, right? We start engaging this work and we want to go farther and farther. But as I share with my colleagues and I'll share with the audience today, subsequent webinars across this academic year will guide us through the rest of the book. I'm going to ask our colleague, Ezra Cho, if he could drop a link to a free copy of The Gift of Black Follk for a free e-copy in the chat session. And that way you guys can link to the book. And those of you who have not had a chance to read it, I do want to encourage you to get the link, engage the book. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of scholarship by W.E.B. Du Bois. What struck me as I read through this work, these first two chapters of The Gift of Black Follk, what struck me was the relevance 100 years later of Du Bois and his thoughts to high-level scholarly and cultural conversations that are occurring today in the news and on college campuses across America. As I read the work, my mind connected Du Bois's history of African people in early North America to important scholarly books, including Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi, A Black Woman's History of the United States by Dinah Raymond Berry and Kayla Nicole Gross, and The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story by Nicole Hannah Jones. Now, that is all that I'm going to say about Du Bois's book for now, because I'm joined today by three wonderful scholars and human beings. Dr. Reginald K. Ellis of Florida A&M University, Dr. James Ford III of Occidental College, and my colleague, Dr. Emanuela Amoh of Baylor University. Now, after their initial remarks, our panelists will respond to questions from the audience. So I want to invite each of you to write questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can near the end of the program. Our first speaker for today is Dr. Reginald K. Ellis. Dr. Ellis is the Provost Professor of Community Outreach, Engagement, and Research, and Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Florida A&M University. He received a Bachelor's of Science in African American Studies and a Master's degree in U.S. History, both from Florida A&M University. He earned his PhD in U.S. History from the University of Memphis. Dr. Ellis's first book, Between Washington and DuBois, The Racial Politics of James Edward Shepard, was published by the University Press of Florida. He is the co-editor of the volume, The Seed Time, The Work, and the Harvest, New Perspectives on the Black Freedom Struggle in America, also published with the University Press of Florida. His second monograph, Black Education Equals Black Freedom, A Defense of Black Higher Education, is under contract with Norton Press and is scheduled for completion in 2025. Dr. Ellis, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. And I want to, again, thank you and your team at Baylor for inviting me to be a part of this very important panel. I'm humbled to be here. I'm going to jump right in just so we can save us enough time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to read my remarks very briefly. On the verge of the semi-quincentennial of the United States of America, having the opportunity to look back over the messiness of the previous 250 years of the development of what is now America, as a historian, I am drawn to the writings of scholars who were preparing to commemorate the sesquicentennial. Thus, The Gift of Black Follk, published nearly 150 years after the nation was established and nearly 60 years after slavery was abolished, speaks to, at least in my mind, Black folk place in the making of this nation. In the first two chapters of this study, DuBois attempts to address who Black folk were and what they brought to the United States of America. In some ways, this study was a continuation of The Negro, in which DuBois published in 1915 to convince Black and white folk of the overall humanity of Black folk, diasporically speaking. The Gift of Black Follk specifically highlights the value of Black folk in America, how they supported the founding and establishment of this land, and more broadly, what this nation owed them. For me, as I revisited this study and understanding the time in which it was written, it is important to highlight that just 9 years earlier, The Birth of a Nation was released, in which Black folk were depicted as evil, lazy, wayward folk that was destroying the fabric of American life. As Professor Johnson just spoke, that kind of resonates today in some ways. This study was just 5 years removed from the Red Summer of 1919, which 25 major race riots destroyed Black folk home, property, businesses, and their lives. Thus, with DuBois's acumen as a researcher, writer, activist, he tells the story of Black folk in America via the Gift of Black Follk in ways that forced Black and white Americans to reimagine Black folk place in this nation at a time when their lives were in constant danger. One of the aspects of the part that we were dealing with that kind of just leaped off the pages for me was the quote that he opened the second chapter with, Black laborers. The quote stated, quote, "How the Negro gave his brain to fill the forest, till the soil, and make America a rich and prosperous land." I sat with that for a while and thought about DuBois challenging his readers, a reader of the 1920s who were witnessing Black people being lynched, being denied equal access to basic human rights, to reconsider the enslavement of Black folk, that our ancestors, via the horrific institution of slavery, built this nation via our labor, our free labor, and thus just 2 years prior to the 150th celebration of the founding of this nation, was making an argument of the great debt that the United States of America owed Black people, yet was still being denied in 1924. And in many ways, this was a payment that was arguably or is arguably still needed. And so I will pause there and pivot to our other colleagues and look forward to jumping back in.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis. I really do appreciate that. And already I wrote down a couple of questions I think I want to ask the group later on based on some of the things you just said. Our next speaker this afternoon is Dr. James Ford III. Dr. Ford is the Mary Jane Hewitt Department Chair in Black Studies and Associate Professor of English and Black Studies at Occidental College. He received his bachelor's degree from Morehouse College and his MA and PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Ford is a prize-winning author. His first book, Thinking Through Crisis, Depression-Era Black Literature, Theory and Politics, published by Fordham University Press, received the William Saunders Scarborough Book Prize from the Modern Language Association. He is currently at work on his second and third monographs. The project Phyllis, the Black Swan, Disheveling the Origins of African-American Letters, studies how the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley imagines humanity outside of political slavery and chattel slavery. The project Hip Hop's Late Style, Lighter Notes to an Aesthetic Theory, reframes hip hop as an experiment with various styles of life. Dr. Ford?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. You ever had a situation where you heard a debate and you knew that you disagreed with some of the discussants, but you didn't know how to reply? And then you woke up one day and were kind of like, now I know what I would have said. My presentation comes from that kind of experience, okay? This essay addresses a missed intellectual opportunity that I observed as a graduate student from 2003 to 2009. At the University of Notre Dame, Jacques Derrida's philosophy of deconstruction was all the rage, especially several of his books around the idea of the gift. And Derrida sought a radical view of the gift that could not be reduced to utilitarian transactions. So he's thinking about how this idea of the gift can really set a new standard for the most radical version of ethics. He went so far as to say that even the giver would have to forget their giving of the gift to avoid transforming the gift into another debt, into another selfish transaction. I watched my peers and professors tussle intellectually over Derrida's theses. I watched them trace how Derrida and other French philosophers took positions that made them heirs to Edmund Husserl or Martin Heidegger or Marcel Mauss. And I marveled as my peers and professors avoided the issue of race with almost Gabby Douglas-style acrobatics. We have to remember it was Edmund Husserl who pushed to give his endowed chairship in philosophy to his mentee, Martin Heidegger in Germany, only for Heidegger to join the Nazis and betray his Jewish mentor. And so for this reason alone, Heidegger has much more to learn about the gift than he has to teach. Meanwhile, when I was in grad school, I dove into the writings of R.A. Judy, Nahum Chandler, and Joy James, among others, during a renaissance in DuBois scholarship. Indeed, DuBois was in the same generation as Marcel Mauss. Mauss even published his famous essay, The Gift, 1 year after DuBois published The Gifts of Black Follk. While Mauss's theory of the gift has been cited time and again, DuBois's idea has yet to be rigorously defined and methodically applied as a concept. And so in this essay, I invite scholars to join me in developing the gift as a concept informing Black studies and providing a corrective to Western thought. In Souls, that is the Souls of Black Folk, the gift addresses cultural production and collective self-consciousness. By the time of and that's 1903. By the time of Black Reconstruction in 1935, the gift repeatedly shows up in Du Bois's account of how the dark proletariat pushed cultural production and economic production towards a more democratic politics in the Reconstruction period. The Gift of Black Folk, written and published in the 1920s, was crucial to expanding and transforming this idea of the gift in souls into the broader purposes that it served in Black Reconstruction. In Souls, Du Bois mentions the Negro's gift of second sight, and he mentions the sorrow songs as the only aesthetic gift that America has given the world. By treating the sorrow songs as the gift, Du Bois offers folk culture as a corrective to indebtedness, to industrialization, and to a new pop culture in America that fetishized Black life. In The Gift of Black Folk, especially the chapter on Black labor, Du Bois expands the idea to encapsulate certain aspects of economic production as well. Indeed, he concludes that chapter by saying, "Let us think of the slave as a laborer, as one who furnished the original great labor force of the New World, and differed from modern labor only in the wages received, in the political and civil rights enjoyed, and the cultural surroundings from which he was taken." It is not hard to see that this stance provides the basis for the Black Worker, Chapter 1 in Black Reconstruction that came out in 1935. Most importantly, the Black Labor chapter esteems what Du Bois calls the Black worker's new spiritual values, that's his phrase, which were not yet fully realized, but implied a different outlook on economic production and politics and culture. What white managers mistook for laziness was actually a refusal, that's Du Bois's word, a refusal to work when the Black worker, quote, did not find the spiritual returns adequate, end of quote. Du Bois closes the chapter by saying, and this is a long passage, the Negro workman came out of an organization of industry that was communistic and did not call for unlimited toil. The white laborer brought to America the habit of continuous toil, which he regarded as a moral duty. The Black laborer brought the idea of toil as a necessary evil, ministering to the pleasures of life. While the gift of the white laborer made America rich, it will take the psychology of the Black laborer to make America happy. Then, the Black laborer's subconscious contribution to economics will be recognized as of tremendous and increasing importance. As I read this passage, subconscious does not mean that Black laborers were unaware of their alternate vision of work and industry. No, the idea was subconscious because so many in the white majority violently suppressed the idea from the 1880s until the 1920s, just like Professor Ellis was saying about all of the violent repression that was going on in recent years. It was forcibly stalled and propagandized in hopes that Black people would misremember their own cultural ethos, and non-Black Americans who might fairly consider the idea would never even be introduced to it. In effect, Black Reconstruction corrected the academic record and reminded America of what it tried to forget through terroristic violence. All right? The Reconstruction era, and that thing that these terrorists wanted us to forget was the Reconstruction era, where Black people actively reorganized labor, politics, and education from that communistic perspective. I'm using Du Bois's word and I'm sticking with it. In Black Reconstruction's 5th chapter, The Coming of the Lord, Du Bois discusses the Black soldier who fought valiantly and convinced Lincoln to write his Emancipation Proclamation. And there Du Bois says a new song arose, a gift drawing inspiration from Africa while finding voice with Black emancipatory projects across the Americas. Here, the sorrow songs of slavery became all-out joy and more powerful because aesthetic beauty commingled with truth and justice. In Chapter 7, Looking Forward, in Chapter 7 of Black Reconstruction, Looking Forward, the gift takes on a more practical significance as it relates to the rights that must be bestowed on the Black population to ensure that the Confederate rebellion does not resurge to destroy the Union. And I would argue you can see that pattern recur from the 1800s to the very present. Every time the rights of Black peoples, broadly speaking, are denied or suppressed, you see the resurgence of the far right in the United States. in chapters 10 and 11 of Black Reconstruction. This practical dimension shows up in Black contributions to conventions that transformed Confederate states into Reconstruction governments. In his account of Mississippi and Louisiana's reconstructions, DuBois says, quote, "The intelligent freedmen were thus bidding for the economic leadership of the mass of freed slaves and offering them democratic sharing in the profits." And I would argue just that phrase, democratic sharing, shows us where this idea of the gift might go if DuBois wasn't juggling so many other ideas at the same time, all right? Then there's chapter 15, and this is where I come to my conclusions. Then there's chapter 15, founding the public school. There, DuBois argues that the freed person's desire for education, which converged with industrialism's need for better trained labor, led to the opening of public schools in the South for the first time ever. And I almost said Black public schools, but DuBois is making a bolder claim than that. He's not just saying majority Black schools got founded. He's saying Black people were the basis for starting public schools in the South, period, for anybody, okay? Whites at all economic levels thought education was a luxury for plantation owners, for the people that we today would call the 1% or the oligarchs. In contrast, the freed persons considered education the gift that provides the basis for any democracy worthy of the name. DuBois concludes that chapter with a stanza from James Weldon Johnson's poem, O Black and Unknown Bards, and it reads, quote, "There's wide wonder in it all, that from degraded rest and servile toil, the fiery spirit of the seer should call these simple children of the sun and soil. O Black slave singers gone, forgot, unfamed, you alone of all the long, long line of those who sung untaught, unknown, unnamed, have stretched out upward, seeking the divine." In my book, Thinking Through Crisis, I turn to this poem to argue that when today's educators face economic distress, we should take heart. The dark proletariat instantiated American education in a much more chaotic period. And so we too can turn these chaotic moments into the basis for revolution and reform if we can find our collective agency. Today, this poem helps me to explain why Derrida's idea of the gift faltered. This is me flashing back to that moment in grad school where I can finally make the point that I wanted to make back in the day. Derrida could only imagine gifts between contemporaries, and that presentism meant that every gift was on a slippery slope towards routine, selfish transactions. But the Black diaspora treats the gift as a multi-generational practice where any exchange among contemporaries is enabled and complicated by the presence of ancestors. And while the white world made capitalistic labor the basis for democracy, the Black world made the gift the basis for democracy. And one can literally chart out Jim Crow's emergence as a tax on the gift wherever it emerged across the South or anywhere else in the United States. Indeed, it was these sinister strategists who, decades later, informed the very Nazi jurists who called Martin Heidegger their colleague. Considering that we are living in another period of reaction, we must ask ourselves, how will we embrace the gift as a basis for cultural production, economic production, and democratic politics? How will we protect the gift against backlash, against a backlash that hopes to establish Jim Crow 3.0? And which ancestors will we turn to as inspirations for our efforts? And which gifts will we leave those who follow us? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ford. As I continue to listen to you all, you all are feeding my mind in so many different ways. And again, I want to invite our audience, if questions pop into your head while we're talking, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A session, and we'll be sure to try to get to them after the initial remarks. At this time, rounding out our panel today is Dr. Emanuela Amoh. Dr. Amoh is an assistant professor of history at Baylor University and my colleague, where she teaches history of modern Africa and the United States in global perspective. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Ghana, Legon, and a master's degree from Illinois State University, and a PhD from Purdue University. Dr. Amoh's scholarly publications include the prize-winning journal article in the African Studies Review, The Dilemma of Diasporic Africans, Adger Emerson Player, and Anti-Americanism in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana. Her article, Revisiting Kwame Nkrumah's African Personality, the Diaspora Context and the Making of Ghana Television in Ghana Studies Journal, and Disrupting Race and Nation, African Students' Nationalism in the Post-War United States, to be published later this year in the Journal of African American History. Dr. Amoh?
Thank you very much, Ron. I'm very excited and honored to be part of this, colleagues and presenters, to be part of this discussion. And so to jump in, I just want to start with my encounter with DuBois. So as Ron mentioned, I hold a bachelor's degree from University of Ghana. And growing up in Ghana, I discovered there is a statue of DuBois. There is a center, a DuBois center, which as a Ghanaian, kind of piqued my interest, and I had questions as to why we have this figure or we have this center. It was years later in the United States that I got to know DuBois. And so then I started to think more, what is the connection between DuBois and Ghana? And of course, that has been the basis of most of the works that I've done. It's a thread throughout my work, looking at the relations between African Americans and Ghanaians. But I shared this story to kind of draw to encourage the audience to think of the legacy of DuBois outside the US context. I know that the gift of the Black folks is, the gift of Black folks to the making of America, which is what he's doing, or he attempts in this book. But he's also speaking to the diaspora. He's speaking to continental Africans. He's one of the things about DuBois is that he connects the struggle, the domestic struggle, to the international struggle, especially the struggle of people of color trying to seek justice, trying to seek freedom. And so that is something that I want the audience to keep in mind, even as we discuss these two chapters. And so thinking about the context or the period when this book is published in 1924, by this period, DuBois had or much later, he would have the title, he would acquire the title of the father of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is a movement of Africans, people of African descent, seeking economic, social, and political rights or development. It is an idea and it is also a movement. And W.E.B. Du Bois is known as the father of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism takes roots in the 19th century. And so by this period, W.E.B. Du Bois has already participated in the first Pan-African Congress in Britain. It is where he will make the statement that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, which is the famous the color line thesis that we often refer to when we discuss racial politics, or trying to understand the role that African Americans have played and the ways in which their effort towards the liberation of this country, the development of this country has not been recognized. And so in this Pan-African space, Du Bois connects the struggles of African Americans to people of African descent in West Africa, those in the West Indies, those in Europe as well. And this Pan-African agenda is to not just assert the hopes and inspiration of people of color, but also to unite as a way to mobilize global efforts to liberate and to also demonstrate the ways in which they continue to shape the modern world. When we look at the gifts of Black folks, as my colleagues have mentioned, that he emphasizes, especially with the first two chapters, the contributions that African Americans have made towards the making of the United States. But when you read their work, you also see that he's constantly making reference to Africans. He's constantly making reference to the continent of Africa, which I think is very important and very deliberate on his part, because during this period in history, there is a lot of mischaracterization and misrepresentations of not just African Americans, but Africans as well. And so people of African descent. And so the stereotypes applies to, and so when he's speaking, the ways he points out, when he points out of Black explorers, he's trying to recast the imagery that we have about people of African descent, not just in the US, but outside the continent as well. And I think that with this attempt of recasting the imagery of Blackness, I would say, because we know that Blackness was racially constructed to justify enslavement of people of African descent. And so his attempt of recasting this, reimagining Blackness is also a way of speaking to the hopes and aspirations of people of African descent, both within the US and outside the US as well. And he's inviting us to see the Black body in different ways. When you think of the Black body, the imagery that comes to mind, especially during this period, Reggie mentioned, the birth of a nation, even how the Black body is portrayed. And so he's inviting us to rethink how we see the Black body, not just as a laborer, but as an inventor, as an explorer, whose contribution in some ways we can say that helped in the discovery, and I'm using the quotation marks here, the discovery of the Americas. And so these are some of the ways that he's inviting us to reimagine Blackness, reimagine the Black body, and how we see African Americans. And of course, with the gift, my colleague James has mentioned, the culture. You can think of, we think of Africanism, stating the African cultural heritage among African Americans that has enriched American culture. When you think of American diversity, African Americans have played crucial role, not just by their mere presence, but by what they have done over the years. And so these, once again, when you even think of these kind of contributions, he makes references and connects it to Africa, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think is very deliberate on his part as a Pan-Africanist, to draw attention to the connections between African Americans and Africans, and also the ways in which Africa is helping develop these Western nations. Finally, when we think of the Black labor, I think that when you talk about if you ask anyone, is there a question about African Americans' contributions to the making of the United States, to U.S. economy? No one would question. I don't think. Perhaps there might be few people that would question that, oh yes, African Americans contributed to the development of this country. But I think what the majority of people do not take into consideration is the magnitude of that labor, that contribution. That is what a lot of people do not understand. And I think that is why you would have the Black problem in the 1920s, or what they would term as the Negro problem in the 1920s, because several people do not really appreciate and understand the pains, the psychological, social impact or contributions that African Americans made to build what we now see as the United States. And so I believe in this book, he's inviting us to see it. And that is why he's very deliberate, talking about specific things that people did. One of the things that I found very interesting was that during this period, Black inventors often did not get credits for the things that they did. And it wasn't just Black inventors. You have musicians who write songs who will not be credited for what they did. Or you have scholars who write books that they will not be given the credit that was due. And so in this book, once again, he's inviting us to really pay attention to the narrative that we have heard over the years about the development of the United States and the place that African Americans hold. So I would like to wrap up once again, going back to the point that I made earlier, that when we think of DuBois and his legacy, it's not just within the United States, it is across the globe. It is in Asia, it is in Africa, it is in the Caribbean. And that is how much, not just to his genius, but then his way of drawing attention to the gift of Black folks, those in the United States and those outside the US. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amoh. My only regret is that we're not sitting live and you guys can't hear the adulation of the audience, because I'm just thrilled. I'm just sitting here and I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, gosh, I have the best job in the entire world. I mean, I get to be around brilliant undergraduates, brilliant graduate students, and brilliant colleagues all the time. And so I'm just listening, and I thank you guys so much for these insightful perspectives on the on the first parts of the Gift of Black Folks. And as a moderator, to the audience, I do want to invite you again to put your questions in the Q&A session. But as the moderator, I'd like to pose a question or two before we open it up to the audience. And I think, to me, given that the Baylor series, the overall year-long series, is titled Celebrating and Connecting the Scholarship of Pioneers with Contemporary Issues, I'd like to ask each of you to discuss, if you will, some of the misconceptions, some of the mischaracterizations about people of African descent that W.E.B. Du Bois addresses in these first two chapters. And I think each of you have talked about that in some way, but some of these, it seems to me that some of these misconceptions and mischaracterizations continue to exist a century later. And so would you identify some of those that you saw in the reading? But then I'm going to push you a little bit to tell us why you think it might be important for us to talk about these racialized tropes in our own time within and also beyond the Black community. And I'll let you moderate yourselves and decide who wants to go first.
I'll jump in, Ron, if you don't mind. So when I went back to revisit this work, it really was striking to me because of what we are currently living in the 21st century in the United States of America. To think that Du Bois is sitting, and writing and researching and telling the story of Black people in a way that at that point really hadn't been teased out in the way that we have the opportunity, the resources that we have because of individuals like Du Bois. He's telling this story of Black people, not only diasporically speaking broadly, but specifically what Black people had built, which is now the United States of America. He's forcing Americans and global people, global citizens, if you will, to reimagine who Black people are from the continent through the Caribbean and in America. So what I think he's addressing is these lies, right? Eddie Glaude talks about the lies that James Baldwin referred to. He's addressing the lies that Black people were lazy. He was addressing the lies that Black people were unreligious folk. He was addressing the lies that Black people were just waiting for someone to come to the continent to bring them out of darkness into this great light. And to your point, he talks about the explorers who founded America alongside these Europeans. And he talks about, let's think about slavery different, right? Let's think about the institution of slavery and how these individuals, through their labor, through their forced labor, in surviving the brutality of the institution of slavery, absent of that, we don't have what we have as a nation today. So let's think about that differently. Bend the arc of time and come to the 21st century, and we see and that's why I kind of, booked in them. We're about to celebrate the semi-quincentennial of the United States of America. And in some ways, the conversation is very, very similar, right? Where we're not just talking about, Black people in the same way that they were talking about Black people in 1924. They're otherizing several groups of individuals in the same way that Black people were otherized. And so you challenged us. And the question is, how do we as scholars do what Du Bois did? And I think that that's the role that we play. We have to continue to research. We have to continue to write, and we have to continue to share and tell the story from an intellectual, from an academic perspective, so that we can create a foundation for the scholars yet unborn, that they will have a platform to now take the works that we are doing in 50 to 150 years from now, and would say that, hey, these scholars talked about the same issues in the same way that we're living. Hopefully they won't be living it in the way that we are living it, but if they are, this is what we are addressing. And this is how I thought this. It was very refreshing for me to look at it and understand what Du Bois was living and how he continued to fight. We know he was writing the Crisis magazine at the same time, and all of this, and playing a very major part in the Harlem Renaissance. So I think it was a very brave, if you ask me.
I could jump in to give one example of how Du Bois was challenging stereotypes and misconceptions. The whole discourse on handouts and entitlements from the late 20th century to the present. You heard it more in the 80s and 90s going into the 2000 aughts, but it still shows up in different ways today. That entire language was meant to spin and use propaganda to purposely misinterpret the gift, right? That Black folk had done so much for the nation that on a federal level, the nation had to pay them back. And so how do you spin that? You spin it by saying it's handouts. They didn't earn anything. They didn't do any work, right? You just flat out deny that the work that they did to build the country wasn't from their own hands, from their own effort. So then the gift, the gift is now distorted, misinterpreted. So you could say it came from a whole different source. And these random people just want to get something for nothing, right? And so Du Bois, from that angle, would urge us today to reassert the gift. Here's what we've given, right? And this goes back to my point about ancestry. We won't let you forget what our predecessors contributed. We refuse to begin on the premise that we didn't contribute anything. So once you begin from the premise of our folks basically built this thing, and I'm saying that nicely, there are certain things that have to follow from that, because for Du Bois, the gift is linked to justice. You get what I'm saying? It's linked to beauty, but it's also linked to justice. Folks would love to detach it from justice so that it can be about laziness or these other claims. But once it's linked to justice, we can take different kinds of stands for ourselves and for others.
Okay, so I just want to add a few sentences to what Reggie mentioned in terms of the lazy trope, the laziness trope. I think Zimmerman Rice talks about the contradiction in the late 1800s, especially during the era of Reconstruction, the contradiction about how Black people or African Americans were perceived. On one hand, they were perceived as hardworking and yes, were needed to do the work, to work on the fields. And on the other hand, they were also seen as lazy, who wants handouts. And so you have these contradictory images about African Americans during this period, which in some ways, I don't think has vanished. It's still very much with us, where you have the good ones and then the bad ones. These continue to shape how the country, the states or the government, the relationship between the governments and the citizens, the Black citizens of this country. I feel like it continues to shape that relationship. I think one of the trope that I thought was interesting was the ignorant. He used the term ignorant savages. He says that Black people are not just ignorant savages who had no idea of where they were or what they were doing. And so they just show up when they are called on to, and they just show up. By pointing out that they were inventors or, when it came to, I know other chapters talks about the Black soldier fighting for democracy. They are intentional about those adventures. They are very intentional. They are smart people. One of the arguments about from racial sciences during the 1800s was that Black people were inferior. They cannot, produce intellectual work. They cannot produce on the same level as white writers or white scholars. And so what we can argue that much has changed in our times, that, we are Black colleagues here in this space, evidence of how that notion may have changed, but we still, the idea that you need a white scholar to legitimize Black scholarship also in some ways speaks to that idea of ignorance, savage trope that existed during this period, or the idea that they were not intellectual. They were not the intellectual equals to white people, to the point that even if they did something, they couldn't get a credit for it. And so that is one thing that I think still exists in our times, where you always have to prove yourself, explain why you are in a particular space, and need someone to legitimize you. And oftentimes it is a white scholar, a white person in some ways to do that. And so I think that with this book, he's inviting us to rethink some of those racialist ideologies, some that have in some ways still is still infused in the fabric of American society, and how we view and engage Black intellectuals, how we view them, how we even use them in the classrooms, how we engage their materials in the classrooms. So we give them equal, for lack of a better word, do we give them equal engagement? Also, one of the things that Black feminists really push against is how some of their scholarship are not credited to be intellectual enough because of the methodologies they use, because of the citations they use. I think that it's rooted in some of these tropes of intellectual inferiority or ignorant savages, which I think we have to not just talk about it, but also rethink how we do that.
Thank you all so much. And again, the temptation for the moderator to jump in on conversation, but this is not for me to do that. Hey, we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to direct it to Dr. Ford, because the questioner really liked your conception, talking about Du Bois's conception of the gift, and they ask, did Du Bois have any religion in mind, Dr. Ford? Was he talking about ways in which Black people gave a gift of religion or spirituality to North America, to the world in this period?
Yes, I saw that question. The answer is yes, and the answer is you can look all over Du Bois's writings and see that he never stops thinking about religion, but he does it in really nuanced ways that we often understate. And so if you go to Souls of Black Folk, read the chapter of the Faiths of the Fathers. And even though he's talking about Negro revivals deep in the South, there's references that he's making that aren't just about Christianity, even though he's mainly talking about Christianity. You see what I'm saying? There's in Black Reconstruction, the chapter where he talks about emancipation is titled The Coming of the Lord, right? Which is a term that he also uses in Souls of Black Folk, right? And that quote that I gave from James Weldon Johnson is all about the so-called lowly people reaching for the divine. And so Du Bois never abandons discussing Black spirituality. And for him, the gift is inseparable from thinking about spirituality, right? Because in the Gift of Black Folk, he says that Black people refuse to do certain kinds of labor, not because they're lazy, but because that kind of labor isn't spiritually adequate, right? That was the phrase he used, which I feel like you could write a whole essay on, right? From our different spiritual traditions, what would it mean to say certain kinds of labor are beneath us because they're not spiritually adequate? And why would you think we're going to do this our whole life, right? And so I'll just say that for now, but there's a lot of room to think about how this idea of the gift shows up in religious discourse and in disciplines like religious studies, so on and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ford. Dr. Ellis, while you were talking, a question came in from the audience, and I'm gonna pass it off to you if you don't mind, Dr. Ellis. And the question is asking about the ways in which Du Bois, one is not like Black studies and the study of Black people doesn't seem to be valued in our educational systems going through K through 12 and into university. And I guess the question I have with you, how would exposing more people to Du Bois earlier in our educational systems, how would that influence the way in which Black people are seen in the United States?
Yeah, I think that that's really very important. I think that's why you see that from my assessment. I think that's why you see that certain books are being banned in certain states, because I think that when you start to expose kids as early as middle school to souls of Black folk, um, to give these individuals opportunity to start to really tease out who it is Black people are, how they think, what they have, with their value system. It makes them start to, for Black people, it gives them opportunity to reconsider who it is that they derive from, as opposed to somebody telling them you were just dropped in America in 1619 or prior to, blah, blah, blah. In the instant. But then when you start to read for yourself, a Black scholar who received a PhD from Harvard University and goes on to be one of the world's greatest intellectuals, consistently speak about Black people in that era, Jim Crow, around racism, around lynchings, and consistently challenging America to really be inclusive. This concept of diversity, equity, and inclusive. You had someone writing about that before DEI became a real thing. I think it's important, from my assessment, to really not just expose Black folk, but everyone worldwide to this type of reading, to this type of writing, because it challenges us to now to look at each other differently, to look at the humanity of all citizens, to look at the value of everyone, and the fact that we live in, some of us live in states where that's challenging. They certain individuals feel that challenges them at their core, and makes them uncomfortable. What I would argue is that we've been uncomfortable our whole lives because we've been told that we didn't matter, we weren't included. So I think it's time for us to not. I really think that it's important that we keep these books, to keep these writings, and keep these scholars at front of mind, particularly in moments like this.
Excellent. And Dr. Amoh, thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. Dr. Amoh, a question just came in. I was going to ask a very similar question. I'm gonna take the questioner's question and go with it. And they're asking, Dr. Amoh, how would you integrate the gift? And actually, I'm gonna have Dr. Amoh start, but I may actually have all three of you get in on this. How would you integrate the gift narrative in a global conversation about reparative justice?
And that's a very good question. I had to think for a second. I think, as I said from the beginning, that when we think of Du Bois, we shouldn't think of him just within the United States. We should think of him outside the US. He rises in 1920s, but we know that he, as a civil rights activist, he wasn't just a civil rights activist, he was a human rights activist. He was interested in labor rights. He was interested in the rights of people of color, not just people like of African descent, but people in Asia, people everywhere where humanity exists. And so in some ways, and when you look at even the Gift of Black Follk, when he talks about the Black laborer helping build America's economy, we know that they were not just building America's economy, because America's economy during that period was connected to the economy in Europe and the economy in Asia or the Caribbean. And so these are some of the ways that they are contributing. When they produce tobacco or cotton in the South, It's traveling outside the United States. It's going to Europe. It's building the economy over there. And so that is a global conversation that I know Black studies scholars will talk about the Black Atlantic, and in that space, you get a sense of the impact that, or the gift, the impact of this gift outside the US. And so when we think of reparative justice, I know that in modern Africa, for instance, there are advocates, people are pushing for reparations for the colonial projects in places like Kenya, where they are pushing for Britain to at least provide some kind of reparations for the Mau Mau, the impact Mau Mau movements in Kenya. And they've actually taken steps to address that in some ways by providing funds for some of the veterans of the Mau Mau movement. These are the conversations that DuBois connected to what was happening within the US as well. Reparations for not just what they contributed, but the atrocities that that was unleashed on people of Africa, upon African Americans within the US. When you think about lynching, destruction of Black wealth or properties and lives, these are things that connect globally. It didn't just happen within the US. And so I just want to wrap this point up by pointing out that we know DuBois will eventually go to Ghana, live in Ghana, and die in Ghana. That in itself is a global conversation about this gift of Black folks, the gift of Black folks in music, in intellectual works, traveling across the globe. So I think these are some of the ways that we can engage with a gift on a global stage.
And Dr. Ford, I really want to give you an opportunity, since you really honed in on the idea of the gift, and to what extent and how does it reshape our understanding of restorative justice when we think about the Black existence as a gift?
Well, thinking more about what Professor Amoh said, thinking about the Mau Mau and others, right? When you acknowledge the gift, you can also acknowledge the theft, right? Who stole from us? And that's in many ways the conversation that folks don't want to have. If you can downplay the discussion of the gift, then you can downplay the discussion of the theft. And so one passage that I didn't read, just to make sure I stayed within 10 minutes for my presentation, but in Black Reconstruction, in that same chapter that discusses Mississippi and Louisiana and how Black people were, in the state convention were, reformulating, reforming how Mississippi and Louisiana function on a governmental state government level. It talked about, there's a few passages that talk about how there were federal funds sent to Mississippi, and the governor refused to just give the funds to the people that were designated to get it. Mostly Black folk, but even some poor white folk didn't get their money because the governor just said, I'm not going to give it. And in fact, in the passage, the governor replied and said, I'm not giving it to the people because it was a private gift. And people still do that today. I'm from Florida. I know about that. Not to say I'm the only one, but that same strategy is used across the South to say that federal funds were actually private gifts. And then the governor or a certain senator or something or judge has the ability to decide if that gift actually goes to the people that it was designated for, right? The more we can actually document and identify that as theft, we can shift the discussion and also shift what kind of political action we can pursue.
Wow. Well, everyone, we've come to the end of our webinar on the chapters Black Explorers and Black Laborers from W.E.B. Du Bois's The Gift of Black Folk. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Reginald Ellis, Dr. James Ford, Dr. Emanuela Amoh, for a delightful conversation. I want to thank the audience for tuning in and posing such great questions. And I want to invite each of you to the next Du Bois webinar, Emancipation of Democracy, which will be held on Thursday, October the 10th, and hosted by my colleague from the Baylor University School of Law, Dr. Patricia Wilson. You don't want to miss that. But for now, goodbye, and everybody take care.